After a very boring first round where everyone drew their games, in the second round there was always a winner and a loser in every single one of the boards. It was absolutely mind-blowing. In the game of Fabiano Caruana versus Nijat Abbasov, everything was doing great until Abbasov took the pawn on c4. Hey, that's a free pawn. What can you do? Just take it. But the problem is, now the bishop is not defending the pawn on f5 anymore, and Fabiano just took it. Now after bishop takes b3, queen takes b3, Abbasov now took the pawn on a5, hoping that Fabiano would just simply take back. The problem is that Fabi goes rook a to f1, doubling up the rooks, threatening to go rook to f7 with a double check to the king and to the queen, and just ending the game right away. And you can't really avoid that without losing your queen or really weakening your king, so Abbasov in this position just decides to resign the game. In the game of Ian Nepomniachtchi versus Alireza Firouzja, everything was pretty equal up until this point where Alireza was really low on time and he went queen to g6, blundering the bishop on e7. You might say, alright, just rook a to e8, and the queen has to move away and we can just take the bishop. The thing is that after rook to e8, we can just go queen to g7 check, forcing the queen trade. After queen takes g7, pawn takes g7 check, you have to take with the king, and bishop to d7, getting the bishop out of danger and attacking the rook on e8. So instead of going rook to e8, Alireza Firouzja decides to take the pawn on h6, but the queen on the 7th rank was just a big pain in the butt for Alireza Firouzja, and eventually Ian Nepomniachtchi found a very clean win to end the game in a win. In the game of Praggnanandhaa versus Gukesh on the other board, Pragg was just sacrificing pawns all over the place, and in this position he found the beautiful bishop takes d5. That is a brilliant move, sacrificing the bishop for 2 pawns and a lot of activity. You're centralizing the knight on d5, opening up the d-file. But after bishop to e7, he decides to go queen to g4, and this is kind of a decisive inaccuracy in the game because Gukesh can get now knight to d8, putting a lot of pressure on the pawn on e6, on the knight on f7, so Pragg just decides to chop off the knight on d8 right away. After bishop takes d8, there's queen to d4, touching the rook on a7, rook to b7 and rook to e4, and Pragg wants to double up on the e-file. Gukesh goes bishop to f6, attacking the queen, and if you take the bishop with the knight, they can just take back with the rook, attacking this pawn multiple times. You have to defend it again, and then they just go rook to e7 and the pawn is going down and the white pieces are losing. So instead, Pragg decides to go queen to e3, and eventually Gukesh finds a way to take the pawn on f2, and Praggnanandhaa resigns the game because Gukesh is threatening some nasty discovered checks with the bishop on c5 and the rook on f2. And if you try to get out of those discovered checks with king to h1, there's simply rook to f5 attacking the queen, you're dropping the knight on d5 and you will be down a full piece. And the game you were all waiting for, Hikaru Nakamura versus FIDE. Hikaru with the white pieces goes pawn to e4, and we have a Sicilian game. Bishop to b5, this is the Rosolimo attack, and knight to f6, this is the Berlin defense. Pawn to d3, holding the pawn on e4, bishop c5, and both players castle at this point. Pawn to d6, opening up the diagonal for the bishop on c8, pawn to h3, stopping some very nasty pins with bishop to g4, and knight to e7 by FIDE. Hikaru goes pawn to d4, gaining some space in the center, attacking the bishop on c5. FIDE doesn't move the bishop away, instead, he decides to counter-attack the bishop on b5. The problem is that we can just take the bishop on c5, and when they take our bishop, we just take the pawn on d6 with a free pawn. That was just a free pawn. You have to move the knight away. Now this pawn is under attack. So we can just go bishop to g5, pinning this knight, and this is just way too comfortable for the white pieces. Nobody knows why Hikaru didn't go for that. Instead, he went bishop to d3, and now bishop b6, pawn takes e5, pawn takes e5, and knight takes e5. And in this position, FIDE found the crazy idea, bishop takes h3, and I don't know how that is not a brilliant. The idea is that after you take the bishop, there's the absolutely crazy queen to b8 attacking the knight on e5. If you try to defend the knight with the pawn, they will call the arbiter on you, because you cannot move this pawn. This is not a legal move. And if you defend the knight with the bishop, there's just bishop to c7, and there's no other way to defend that knight. But wait a minute, why doesn't he just move the knight out? I'm attacking the bishop, my knight is not under attack anymore. There's a very big problem with this. Remember that I told you that this pawn is pinned. The pawn can't move. So there's queen to g3 check, and you cannot take the queen because the pawn is pinned. After king to h1, queen takes h3 check, you have to go back. Knight to g4, threatening checkmate, and this is just game over. You have to take the knight on g4. So Hikaru saw all this and he was just like, you know what, you can keep your bishop, let me just move my knight out of the way. Bishop to g4, now attacking the queen goes to c2, and bishop to c7. Pawn to e5, opening up the bishop and queen battery, attacking the pawn on h7, also attacking the knight, so it has to move. Knight goes to d7, and bishop takes h7 with a check. King to h8, and now Hikaru was maybe scared of this bishop getting trapped or something, and he went bishop to d3. But the best move was actually queen to e4, and after pawn to f5, cutting off the way of the queen and the bishop, there's just bishop takes f5, and when they take back, queen to h4 check, king to g8 and bishop to g5, putting a lot of pressure on this diagonal. But alright, bishop d3 is a small inaccuracy, it's not the end of the world. Now FIDE goes pawn to b5, attacking the knight on c4, the knight goes to e3, and we have knight takes e5 by FIDE. And now this bishop on d3 is attacked 2 times by the knight and by the queen on d8. So Hikaru goes bishop to e2, asking for a bishop trade, but this inaccuracy is a little bit bigger than the previous one. The best move is just to take the bishop on g4, and when they take everything on d3, we can just finish our development, and there's nothing wrong with this. But instead, after bishop to e2, there's f5 by FIDE, and if you take the bishop on g4, they will take back with the f-pawn, opening up the f-file for the rook. And now Hikaru keeps making inaccuracies, and he goes pawn to f4, attacking the knight on e5. The problem is that this move really weakens this diagonal, and FIDE finds the brilliant bishop to b6, sacrificing the knight on e5, but exploding this diagonal. And now if you take the knight on e5, they have knight to d5, putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the knight on e3. So instead of taking the knight on e5, Hikaru goes king to f2, defending the knight on e3. Now FIDE goes knight to d5, and we have rook to h1 check by Hikaru. And after king to g8, now Hikaru finally takes the knight on e5, but that allows queen to g5, now putting even more pressure on the knight on e3. Now the king has to abandon the defense of the knight, they just trade off a couple pieces. Hikaru wants to trade queens, but FIDE is not interested. Queen to g3 check, king to d2, rook to d8 check, and the king is just running for life. Now queen to g5 by FIDE, I love this move, putting the queen and the king on an x-ray. Hikaru goes b3, trying to run away, and now FIDE plays the very quiet and simple knight to f1, and in this position Hikaru Nakamura resigned the game, because after you go king to b2 running for your life, there's the very simple knight to g3, forking the queen and the rook, and this is just game over for the white pieces. Do you think Hikaru will get back and turn things around to win the candidates? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications, and I will see you in the next game.